There are moments when theatre spills into life, where scripts blur with secrets, and applause masks the sound of something darker unraveling backstage. In this story, murder finds its cue not in shadows, but under stage lights, and the past returns with a blood-red circle drawn around a face no one wanted to remember. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. There's something about actresses that brings out the philosopher in a gumshoe. Maybe it's the way they blink twice before delivering a lie, or the fact that they can turn a torn stocking into a personal tragedy with just the right sigh. Either way, when a woman in mink says someone is going to die, I don't call the morgue. I wait for her to pick a spotlight. That morning started with Wolfe in his usual Monday coma. The Orchid Room from 9 to 11, no exceptions, not even for gunshots. I was at my desk, nursing a cup of coffee that had surrendered sometime around sunrise when the doorbell rang. I answered it because no one else was going to, and found myself face to face with a woman who had once graced marquees and now looked like she'd forgotten where they'd been hung. She was beautiful, the way old chandeliers are beautiful, delicate, glowing, and half covered in dust. I knew the type. Drama by reflex, honesty only on cue. But there was something in her eyes, a tremble that wasn't rehearsed. I let her in. After all, some monologues are worth hearing, even the deadly ones. Delia Vance moved into the office like a woman entering her own eulogy, slow, poised, and with a perfume that had lingered in dressing rooms long after the curtain fell. She didn't sit until invited, and when she did, it was with the practiced grace of someone who had played queens and ghosts in the same breath. "I've come," she said, "because someone is going to die." That was the kind of opening line that would have earned her a matinee ovation, and I'll admit, it had better legs than most. She crossed hers with the kind of tension that told me this wasn't just another fading ingenue angling for attention. Her hands, though gloved, were trembling. I told her Wolfe was unavailable, which was true in the same way that statues are unavailable, not because they can't move, but because they'd rather be chiseled than disturbed. "I'll wait," she said. She did. When Wolfe emerged from his orchid sanctum at 11 o'clock precisely, I gave him the barest of warnings. Client, actress, says death is calling, twice. That bought me one glower, 2 sighs, and a reluctant nod to bring her in. She stood before him like she'd been auditioning her whole life for this role. "Mr. Wolfe," she began, "I am not here on impulse or delusion. I am here because someone will die." 2 bells after curtain. Wolfe, seated behind his desk like a Buddha cursed with sarcasm, said nothing. "I heard it," she continued. "The first bell came last night, a whisper in the wings. The second will come tonight. And when it does, someone will die." Wolfe's lips barely moved. "You believe time is now measured in theatrical omens?" "I believe," she said, eyes suddenly steel, "that I've been marked. Not with a weapon, but with intention." That, I had to admit, was a line worth keeping. Wolfe's brow rose a fraction of an inch, which in our world meant she'd passed the threshold from nuisance to puzzle. The question was, who had written the script? Wolfe regarded her as one might a soufflé that had arrived early and collapsed. "Madam, I am not a spiritualist, nor am I prone to interpret bells as augury. If you have tangible cause to believe a crime will be committed, state it." Delia bristled. "Theatre is a world of shadows and signs, Mr. Wolfe. You should know the stage is not so different from life or death." That earned her an audible sniff. Wolfe leaned back, pressed his fingertips together, and sighed. "I deplore metaphor. It is a refuge for the vague and the self-deceiving." I stepped in, partly to keep the tone civil, partly because I'd seen that particular storm cloud before. "She didn't bring a séance, Wolfe. She brought a warning. Maybe let her unpack it." Wolfe eyed me as if I'd offered him canned soup. Then grudgingly he nodded toward the chair. "Proceed, madam, but spare me poetry." She reached into her handbag and retrieved a cheque already made out. The kind of number that could fund a week of beer for me and a month of sourced quail for Wolfe. "I'm not paying for drama," she said. "I'm paying for protection. If I'm wrong, you keep the money and I leave a fool. If I'm right—" Wolfe cut in. "If you're right, someone dies." She didn't blink. There was a pause, the kind that settles like velvet dust in a closed theatre. Wolfe shifted, a movement so rare it nearly startled me. Then he exhaled, long and slow, as if she had passed some internal test of credibility or stubbornness, or both. "I will make inquiries," he said at last. That's Wolfe speak for "I'm annoyed but interested." I folded the cheque into my pocket, knowing we'd just accepted a ticket, not to a performance, but to something far messier. The next morning, I found myself in a seat I rarely occupy. Row G, centre, house left, courtesy of Wolfe's instructions and Delia's comp list. The play was titled Dying in Lavender, which was promising, if not prophetic. The theatre was small but polished, its lobby lined with posters of past glories and champagne-stained dreams. My job was not to review the show, though frankly I'd have enjoyed that more. Instead, I was to keep my eyes on dressing rooms, stage doors, and any cast member with a twitchy conscience. The house lights dimmed. The first bell rang. I leaned back, arms folded, watching not the actors, but the exits. Wolfe had told me to observe, to absorb, and above all, to expect nothing until the second bell. That's when, according to Delia, the killer would be ready. And if she was right, this performance would be the last for someone. The second bell rang like a quiet drumbeat, not for the audience, but for whatever lay coiled behind the curtain. I had made my way to the backstage corridor by then, using the credentials Delia had arranged. It was a narrow artery of half-dressed actors, frayed costumes, and ancient props that looked better under footlights than daylight. Delia's dressing room was at the end, next to a cracked mirror and a coat rack that leaned like it had stories of its own. She wasn't there, yet, which made what happened next either a coincidence or a carefully rehearsed cue. A voice, soft, male, close, drifted from just behind the half-closed door. "He's ready," it said. That was all. No footsteps, no echo, just two words, spoken with the flat calm of a stage manager calling places. I stepped inside but found no one, no script, no shadow, just the faintest scent of cologne that didn't belong to anyone I'd met. I waited. Delia arrived 3 minutes later, visibly shaken, but said nothing. She didn't have to, her eyes had already heard the voice. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my report with eyelids half lowered. "2 bells, Mr. Goodwin," he murmured. "Now we wait for the curtain." The next morning found me pointed east on 45th Street, headed toward the Presidio Theatre with a trench coat on my back and 3 hours of sleep under it. The coffee I'd grabbed near the corner had all the warmth and charm of a theatre critic with a deadline, but it was company enough. Wolfe, after interrogating me about the width of the lobby and the acoustic properties of the orchestra pit, and naturally whether the building had central heating, had declared himself spiritually allergic to grease paint and thus unfit for fieldwork. That left me to scout the ground, cast, crew, and whatever backstage paranoia Delia Vance had scented. The Presidio was a modest house, built in the 20s, updated sometime after air raids went out of fashion. It had mahogany panels, brass trim dulled by decades of panic and praise, and a lobby full of faces either smiling too hard or not at all. I was greeted by an assistant director with a clipboard for a tongue and led to the rehearsal stage. My brief was simple: observe everything, trust nothing, and if anyone offered me a script, decline unless it was written in blood. I didn't have to ask who Maxim Dawn was. He made his entrance like a man whose reflection deserved applause, 6 feet of tailoring, a jaw carved from Broadway legend, and a cigar that would have been taxed as real estate in 3 states. He walked through the rehearsal hall with the distracted majesty of someone who considered other people either obstacles or scenery. The cast froze mid-line and even the stagehands stiffened. Power does that, especially when it's the kind that tips over lighting rigs if you don't say, "Yes, sir," fast enough. "Goodwin," he said, like he'd been handed a bill he didn't remember signing. "Delia sent you?" "Wolfe sent me," I replied. Delia paid for the privilege. That earned a small, mirthless smile. She always did know how to spend well, less impressive at earning. He didn't wait for follow-up, just turned on his polished heel and shouted something to a lighting tech about the color blue being too introspective. I didn't follow. I'd already gotten what I needed. Maxim Dawn was the kind of man people obeyed without understanding why, and the kind others wanted to see fall, preferably into a pit, preferably deep. Once Dawn had swept off, leaving behind a wake of whispered adjectives, I began the part of the job Wolfe hates most, mingling. The assistant director, whose name I had forgotten before she finished pronouncing it, introduced me to the rest of the cast and crew with the speed of someone escaping a crime scene. First came Judith Kessler, understudy to Delia Vance, and apparently rehearsing the role of timid waif with deep trauma. She offered a handshake so fragile it felt like a contract written in soap. Her eyes darted like she was scanning for exits, and her voice hovered somewhere between nervous and not allowed. I asked a few gentle questions, received even gentler answers, and made a mental note to observe her again, from a distance. Next, Harold Phipps, the financial backer, introduced as our patron. He had the kind of handshake that tried too hard, and the expression of a man being slowly eaten by his own investment. He smiled often, but the smile never met his eyes. If money talks, Harold's looked like it was whispering for help. Then Theo Carr, the stagehand with a poker face that had been through a few fires. He nodded once, said nothing, and went back to adjusting a sandbag rig like it owed him rent. His hands were steady. His eyes weren't. The stage was full. The script was unwritten. And if there was a killer among them, I had just shaken their hand. I'd spotted her leaning against the wall near the dressing-room corridor, arms folded, eyes half-lidded, like the whole world had shown up late for its cue. Cynthia Vance had her mother's bone structure and none of her patience. She wasn't watching the stage. She was watching people watching the stage, a different kind of performance. "Miss Vance," I said, "or do we skip the introductions and go straight to the part where you tell me I'm wasting everyone's time?" She didn't smile. "That depends." "Are you?" "Too early to tell," I said. "You here to support your mother's prophecy?" She gave me a glance, sharp enough to fillet trout. My mother has always had a flair for melodrama. The fact that someone humors her doesn't make her right or wrong. "You're not worried?" I asked. "Worried? Number?" She straightened. "I'm bored." She didn't elaborate, just turned and walked down the corridor like someone late for an exit she didn't want to explain. I watched her go, thinking 2 things. First, that she knew more than she'd said, and second, that she might not be the only one waiting for a curtain to fall. Back near the stage, rehearsal had resumed, or more accurately, a loosely organized simulation of rehearsal was underway. Dorner was barking about tempo while Judith Kessler stumbled through a scene that demanded authority and delivered only apology. But it wasn't the lines that caught my eye, it was the glances. Judith flinched every time Dorn raised his voice, and he raised it like a man testing acoustics, not directing actors. Once, during a pause, she bent to adjust a shoe strap, and he walked behind her with a deliberate slowness that made the hair on my neck take attendance. When she straightened, her face had changed. The mask was on, but the eyes were gone. Later, as the lighting team adjusted a spotlight, she looked toward the wings and caught sight of Cynthia. The two locked eyes for a moment. Judith looked away first, No one said anything. Nothing overt happened. But if you'd asked me whether what I'd witnessed was staging or strategy, I'd have called it both. Rehearsals are meant to conceal roughness, not discomfort. But this was tension, dressed up as timing, and I'd learned to trust that more than cues. The rest of the afternoon passed like over-rehearsed small talk, polite, dull, and entirely unconvincing. I did my rounds, which meant asking questions that sounded innocent and listening to answers that tried to be. Most of the cast assumed I was either a new producer or an IRS mole, depending on which end of their paycheck they were worried about. I tried charming the stage manager, a brittle blonde named Marla, who treated scheduling as warfare. She offered nothing except a laminated copy of the tech sheet and a warning not to block the fire exits. I cornered Theo Carr again, the stagehand with the 1,000-yard stare, but he gave me nothing beyond a nod and a muttered, "Too many eyes around here." Whether that meant ghosts, rats, or actors, I didn't press. I even attempted a little light flirtation with a dancer from the chorus line. She said she didn't talk to men in suits after noon. By curtain call, I had a notebook full of timing cues, 2 names that might matter, and a headache that had formed somewhere near my left eyebrow. Wolfe would ask if I had anything worthwhile. My answer: not yet, but the theatre's a patient killer. Back at the brownstone, I delivered my report like a waiter describing an undercooked dish, detailed, apologetic, and not particularly appetizing. Wolfe listened with eyelids drawn halfway, sipping Montenegro and dabbing his lip with a linen napkin. He let me finish, then made a small sound, somewhere between a cough and an opinion. "So," he said, "we have a prophecy rendered in metaphor, a list of dramatis personae riddled with insecurity, and an atmosphere thick with performative tension." "That's the working summary," I said. He sighed. "Bah, the theatre breeds symbols the way rabbits breed themselves. Bells, whispers, shadows, all stock. Until someone acts with intent, this remains a game of shadows." "Delia says someone already has," I reminded him. "She says many things. Until someone ceases breathing, I suggest we confine our concern to the living." I nodded. I didn't agree, not fully. But I knew Wolfe. He didn't believe in tragedy until it arrived with credentials. It was near the end of Act 2. The audience applauded a particularly overwrought monologue delivered by Delia with enough force to rattle a chandelier. Then came the scream. Not from the stage, but from somewhere beneath it. Sharp, high, and painfully real. I was on my feet before the applause stopped echoing. The house lights came up in jerks and the cast froze mid-movement. Backstage was chaos. Stagehands rushed. Judith collapsed into a chair. And there, at the edge of the orchestra pit, 2 grips were shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Maxime Dawn lay below, face down, neck at a grotesque angle, a stage weight beside him that hadn't been part of the act. I stood at the edge, looking down at a man who had treated death like drama, until the 2 switched places. The second bell had tolled, and now the curtain was bleeding. You don't need a wall calendar to know what day it is when Inspector Kramer shows up unannounced, just a nose and a barometer. That morning, I got both, the faint stench of city rain on leather soles and the drop in barometric pressure that comes from Wolfe's disapproval coiling in real time. The doorbell had barely gone silent when Kramer burst in with his trench coat still clinging to his shoulders like a wet dog unwilling to leave. I was at my desk, mid-paragraph in a report Wolfe would probably ignore, when the inspector's voice tore through the air like it had a badge of its own. "Where is he?" I made the mistake of answering truthfully. "In the dining room, finishing lunch." "Then he can finish it with company." He didn't wait for permission. He knew Wolfe hated interruptions. That was half the fun. The other half was seeing whether this would be the time Wolfe finally choked on indignation, or just the sauce. I followed him down the hall, already writing the headline in my head: "Detective Gourmet dies of unchewed veal, Chief of Homicide claims victory," Only one thing was certain. The blood wasn't dry yet. Kramer stormed in like a thunderclap that hadn't read the forecast. Wolfe didn't rise, yes, of course, but managed a glance so lethally indifferent that it might have qualified as an insult under municipal code. Wolfe dabbed the corner of his mouth with a napkin. "Mr. Kramer, you are uninvited, you are unwelcome, but alas, you are not unexpected." Kramer snorted. "Maxim Dawn is dead, crushed, backstage at the Presidio. You were warned a murder was coming, and now he's dead. That's a funny coincidence, Wolfe. Real funny." "Your sense of humor remains as elusive as your logic," Wolfe replied, eyeing the last morsel of his veal before spearing it with contemptuous elegance. Kramer dropped a manila folder on the table. "Heard anything worth sharing?" "Only your continued disinterest in evidence," Wolfe said, chewing with the slow, deliberate dignity of a man who refused to be rushed, even by homicide. "You don't find it suspicious?" "I find it unfortunate." He sipped beer, then added, "You have come, as always, to wave conjecture like a banner. When you possess facts, Mr. Kramer, I will listen. Until then, kindly let me eat." Kramer's teeth clenched. Wolfe swallowed. The war had begun. By the time I'd coaxed Kramer into the office, Wolfe had resumed his chair and his disdain, both fully armed. The folder Kramer had tossed at the table lay unopened, like a script Wolfe had refused to audition for. "It was an accident," Kramer said flatly. A stage weight slipped. "It happens." The girl screamed, the crew panicked, and the director hit the floor. Wolfe closed his eyes, not in rest but in recoil. "Accidents, Mr. Kramer, do not occur with such choreographic precision." "Meaning?" "Meaning the timing was exact. The second bell had sounded, the curtain had not yet risen, and the victim was in the precise position to receive the fatal weight. Stagecraft, yes, but not chance." I added, "You should hear Delia. She thinks the second bell was a warning." Kramer's lip curled. "You mean a prophecy?" "No," Wolfe murmured. "A signal." He opened his eyes. "I do not believe in the supernatural, Mr. Kramer. I believe in structure. And this was structured." He leaned forward, fingers steepled. "We have not seen the climax yet. Later that afternoon, I made my return to the Presidio, at this time without the benefit of anonymity. News travelled fast in a theatre, faster when it was bloody, and faster still when it came with sirens. I wasn't met with curiosity so much as suspicion, the kind that doesn't ask what you want, just how long you'll be in the way. Judith Kessler sat alone in a corner dressing room, curled around herself like a paragraph in parentheses. Her costume still hung on the rack, untouched. I knocked lightly, and she looked up with eyes that had seen too much and understood even less. "I didn't think he could die," she whispered, before I'd said a word. "Not him?" I kept it gentle. "Can you tell me what you saw?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd gone back for my necklace. I left it in the wings. When the bell rang, I looked up, and I saw someone." Her hand trembled. "A figure. Just a shadow, behind the curtain line, watching. Man or woman? I don't know, but they were still, like they'd been waiting. I left her there, shaken, but sincere. If she was lying, she deserved a Tony. Theo Carr was nowhere to be found. That might not sound like much. Stagehands vanish and reappear like lighting cues. But the problem was, no one had seen him since the scream. Not the gaffer, not the prop girl, not even Marla, who claimed to run tighter schedules than railroads. I checked the back lot. Empty. I called his apartment. No answer. I even circled by his usual corner diner, where the coffee was weak and the gossip strong. The counterman remembered him. But not today. When I phoned in from a pay booth, Wolfe was not amused. "Vanishing," he said, "is not proof of guilt. It is proof of fear. The question is, fear of what?" "Police," I offered. "Or whoever dropped the weight?" Wolfe paused. "Or of being seen?" Which meant one of two things. Theo had something to hide. or someone had decided he'd seen too much already. Either way, it wasn't my favorite kind of suspense, not the noir kind, the permanent kind. I hung up, scanned the alley one more time, and made a note. When people disappear in this city, they don't always get a second cue. When I got back to the theatre, they were clearing props off stage like broken dreams. Delia Vance was seated stage left, alone, her face pale beneath a thick layer of what remained from Act 2 makeup. I moved toward her, not fast, and got there just in time to see her sway, murmur something, and crumple gently into the arms of a passing grip. We got her water. She revived slowly, blinking as if the air itself had betrayed her. I crouched beside her. "He's dead," she whispered. "I know." She looked straight at me. "But it wasn't him." "Come again?" "The second bell, it wasn't about Maxim. He wasn't the one." "Then who?" Her breath caught. "I don't know, but it's not over. That was just the warning." She touched her throat, then closed her eyes. Some actresses fake a faint. She hadn't. Whatever she believed, it had shaken her loose from the script. And for once, I didn't have a wisecrack ready. I gave Wolfe the news at 7 over his cassoulet. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he did, not with a syllable, but a sound, deep and guttural, halfway between a growl and a groan. He stood. That alone was enough to knock 3 degrees off the room temperature. "This is no longer theatre, Archie. It is orchestration." I raised a brow. "You think Delia's right?" "No." His voice sharpened. "I think she's wrong in the most dangerous way. She believes the myth, but someone else is using it." He turned toward the globe, poured a half measure of brandy, didn't drink it. The first death was the signal. He looked at me, eyes glinting beneath their bulk. The second is the aim. It was 2:15 when I unlocked the side door of the Presidio with a key I wasn't technically authorized to possess. Wolfe had requested verification, and while that's a broad term in detective work, it tends to involve walking into buildings at hours best reserved for ghosts or regrets. The theatre was dead quiet except for the slow moan of a loose shutter on the catwalk. My flashlight made a small moon on the dusty stage. I moved past the wings toward Delia's dressing room, mostly out of habit, and nearly stepped on Judith Kessler. She gasped and jerked upright, clutching her coat around her like a shield made of rayon and nerves. "Miss Kessler," I said, "either you're playing Juliet to an invisible balcony or you've got explaining to do." She blinked at me, eyes wide. "I left something. My earrings. At 2 in the morning. I was afraid they'd be stolen. They're clip-ons." She opened her mouth, closed it again. It wasn't the worst lie I'd ever heard, but it wore thin in all the wrong places. I gestured toward the lobby. "Let's talk. Somewhere that doesn't echo guilt." She hesitated, then followed, which was its own answer. I offered her a seat in the box office lounge, a cracked leather couch that smelled like ambition and stale lipstick. She perched on the edge like the upholstery might accuse her. I kept my tone civil. "So, Miss Kessler, these earrings, you left them where exactly?" "In my makeup drawer. I thought I—" Her purse, which she had gripped like a flotation device, tipped slightly on her lap, spilling a tissue, a lipstick, and a small, folded page that did not belong in a purse or anywhere outside the stage manager's binder. I picked it up before she could snatch it. "What's this?" She paled. I found it backstage. I was going to return it." I unfolded it. The timestamp was unmistakable. It was from the night Maxim Dawn took his final bow, a cue sheet for rig operation. Her name had been penciled in beside the curtain pulley, with a time that sat dangerously close to when the rig dropped. "You were near the rig?" "No, yes, but not. I didn't push, not yet." The paper had done the work. She was guilty of something, but whether it was murder or just proximity to it remained to be seen. Wolfe would know. Back at the brownstone, I laid the logbook page on Wolfe's desk like a diagram of guilt. He peered at it with the disdain of a man asked to consider an unripe tomato. "There," I pointed. "Judith's name." "Q logged at 8:47. Maxime dropped at 8:49. 2 minutes, maybe less." Wolfe squinted, leaned back, and murmured, "2 minutes is ample for catastrophe, but tight enough for intention." "Or orchestration," he replied. "Too neat." I folded my arms. "You think she planted it?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that its discovery was inevitable, which makes its placement deliberate." He reached for his glass of Madeira and took a sip, eyes half-lidded. "Who benefits from Miss Kessler's ruin?" "That depends." He glanced at me. "On what? On whether she's ruined because she was careless, or because someone made sure she looked that way." Wolfe didn't smile. He rarely does. But something flickered across his face, not satisfaction exactly, but the quiet thrill of complexity. "Then we must find the author of this performance," he said, "not the actor." I tucked the page back into the envelope. The play had begun, but the script was forged. We sat in the office while the city outside went about its business of being rude and overcrowded. Wolfe stared at nothing in particular, which meant, of course, he was seeing everything. "This evidence," he said, "is too accessible, too narratively clean." "Someone wants her arrested," I said. He nodded. "Which in turn suggests 2 possibilities. 1, she is innocent, and her ruin is the objective. 2, she is guilty, but not of this. That second one's a little too recursive before lunch," he grunted. "Your digestion is not my concern." We let it hang. Outside, a car honked. Somewhere, Kramer was probably sharpening his complaint. Wolfe leaned forward. "Archie, if I were to plant evidence, and I assure you I would do it better, I would not fold it neatly in a purse." I cracked a smile. "She's being framed." "Framed," he said, "and poorly. We are being asked to accept a narrative composed for police, not for logic." He stood, a rare and unsettling motion, and headed for the orchid room. I knew what that meant. He was angry. And when Wolfe is angry, someone's lies are about to wilt. Cynthia Vance arrived at the brownstone without invitation, but with purpose. She was dressed in grey, which seemed deliberate, the kind of colour you wear when you don't want to be noticed, but can't quite stand invisibility. "I assume," Wolfe said, not rising, "you have something to confess. You may do so. Mr. Goodwin will record it." She met his gaze. "I'm not here to confess. I'm here to clarify." "Splitting hairs is best left to barbers," Wolfe replied. I gestured to the red armchair. She took it. "I was involved with Maxime," she said. No preamble, no blush, just the line, dropped like a stage weight. Wolfe didn't flinch. "Define involved." "He said he loved me. I believed him." "And your mother?" "She didn't know. She would have killed him." I raised a brow. "That's metaphorical, right?" She didn't answer. Wolfe closed his eyes. "Did Maxime intend to make the relationship public?" I think he enjoyed the secrecy." Wolfe murmured, "Yes, predators often do." She sat very still. "And if he had threatened to reveal it?" Wolfe asked. Her silence said more than any speech. When she left, Wolfe said nothing for a long time, but the orchid room door remained shut. Wolfe called Judith Kessler to the brownstone. She arrived draped in nervous apology and a scarf 2 sizes too large for spring. He offered her no tea and no comfort. He asked 3 questions. She answered 2. Then he asked the 4th. "If you killed Maxime Dawn, Miss Kessler, did you intend the second bell as part of the symbolism, or was that a coincidence?" She broke, not into tears, not immediately, but into a stammering cascade of denials, confessions, retractions, and fear. She swore she didn't mean for him to die, only to frighten him. Then she claimed someone else had suggested the plan. Then she said there was no plan. It was, by Wolfe's standards, a masterpiece of coerced chaos. When Kramer arrived 20 minutes later, called in by yours truly, he was given the full recital. "She confessed?" I said. "To what?" he asked. to everything and nothing. Wolfe, from his chair, added, "You may arrest her if you wish to waste your time." Kramer narrowed his eyes. "You're playing a game, Wolfe." "On the contrary," Wolfe said. "I'm playing a symphony. You're just holding a tambourine." Kramer swore. Wolfe smiled. The bait had been swallowed. We were 40 minutes into silence when Fritz entered with a cablegram. Wolfe opened it slowly, as though expecting arsenic. He read it once, then passed it to me. "Harold Phipps found dead. Penthouse. Overdose. Likely suicide." Kramer. Wolfe said nothing. He leaned back, fingers pressed together, and stared at the ceiling like it owed him an apology. "Too early for suicide," he murmured. "Too precise for despair." I said, "You think it's murder?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that Harold Phipps was eliminated." "For what?" "For being a loose thread." He stood. Second time that week, which would have qualified as news even without a body count. I followed him into the office. He didn't speak until seated. A man who forges financial backing for art also learns to falsify silence, but this, he tapped the cable. This was silence with gloves on. That, coming from Wolfe, was as close to a eulogy as Harold would ever get. He remained seated for another 5 minutes, unmoving. Then, in the voice he used for final meals and fatal truths, he said, "Now the curtain rises." I waited, but nothing more came, just that. He didn't need to elaborate. The meaning was clear. Someone had orchestrated this from the overture, through false cues and cheap dialogue, all the way to a deadly second act. But now Wolfe had the score in hand, and someone was about to miss their final mark. He closed his eyes, not to rest, but to calculate. The show, as they say, was just beginning. The day after Harold Phipps exited the stage with a pharmacist's flourish, Wolfe refused to leave his chair. Not from indifference, but from design. His form of pursuit didn't require movement, only momentum, and he had plenty of that. He'd pushed breakfast an hour late and lunch 20 minutes early, which in our world qualified as a crisis in scheduling. He sat with his fingertips steepled beneath his chin, a plate of squab congealing on its second cooling beside him, and dictated conclusions as if preparing an indictment against nature itself. "She played grief," he said. "Played it too soon, too well." "Which she are we talking about?" I asked. "We're knee-deep in ingénue." "Miss Kessler," he said, "fears consequence. Miss Vance fears legacy. Cynthia Vance fears neither. That makes her dangerous." I scribbled dutifully. He gestured at the notepad. "Theatre breeds false confession. We must therefore isolate the moments that were not performed." "That narrows it down to the plumbing schedule." "Do not be glib," he growled. "I am dissecting pathology, not plumbing. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a psychological composition." He resumed chewing, slowly, reflectively. And the autopsy, apparently, had just begun. I made it back to the Presidio around 11. The air inside the theatre smelled like spent cigarettes, ghostly applause, and yesterday's panic. Nothing spooks actors like a death that interrupts a performance. It suggests the play wasn't dramatic enough. The rumour mill had already been greased, lit, and spinning. One dancer said the rigging cable had been sabotaged with acid. Another swore Delia Vance had performed a line not in the script just before the crash, which made her either psychic or complicit, depending on how much she owed the deceased. I moved among them like a man collecting debts no one wanted to admit were owed. A chorus boy pointed me toward the catwalks. A lighting tech whispered something about Judith crying in the stairwell. Marla, the stage manager, refused eye contact altogether, which in theatre terms was practically an affidavit. No one wanted to talk about Theo Carr. No one had seen him. But the silence around him had thickened. That wasn't innocence. That was insulation. I went looking for him, not because I thought he was the killer, but because he hadn't been written out yet. And that, in a theatre, is always dangerous. The storage loft was 4 flights above the stage, tucked behind a curtain of forgotten set pieces and dust-heavy flats. It took some coaxing, 2 splintered handrails, and 1 narrow iron ladder before I found Theo Carr, folded into a corner like someone trying not to be found. He didn't flinch. He just stared. That slow, unblinking look I'd learned meant the brain was moving faster than the face could keep up. "You hiding?" I asked. "Or thinking?" He didn't answer. I crouched beside him. "You saw something." Still no reply, but he reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a stage cue sheet. Not torn, not forged, not planted. It was annotated, personal, the kind of thing a man keeps when he's trying to make sense of what shouldn't have happened. He passed it to me, then said quietly, "She was whispering." "Who?" He shook his head. "I don't know, but I heard her, backstage, just before it fell." "What did she say?" He looked me in the eye. "She said his line, the one from the end of Act 2. "That's not Judith's scene." He nodded. "Exactly." I pocketed the sheet. The rafters don't lie, but they do echo. Back on the main floor, I found the script binder and flipped to the end of Act 2. The line Theo remembered wasn't Judith's. It belonged to Maxim, his final monologue, the big, self-indulgent closer. If I cannot be forgiven, then let the curtain fall without applause. It was melodrama, sure, but the kind that sells. And according to Theo, someone had whispered it backstage seconds before the weight dropped, which meant one of 2 things. Either Maxim was quoting himself like a narcissist in stereo, or someone else had decided to give his exit line the old Greek chorus treatment. I called Wolfe from the payphone in the lobby. He answered after 3 rings, which for him was practically sprinting. When I told him the line, there was a pause. "That line," he said, "was not a message. It was a ritual." "You're sure?" "I am certain." And the tone in his voice had changed from irritation to interest. "Find out," he said, "who else rehearsed that line. Not to perform it, to remember it." He hung up, which meant it was time for someone else to forget pretending. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe had the entire script spread across the desk like battlefield maps. He didn't look up when I entered. "It is not literature," he said, "but it is revealing." I dropped the annotated cue sheet onto the pile. "Theo says he heard someone whispering Maxim's final line before the fall." "I have no doubt," Wolfe replied, "because it was never a line. It was a confession." He tapped the page. "The author rewrote that line during rehearsals. It was cut, removed, never delivered, but someone memorized it. Why?" "Because it mattered," I said. Wolfe nodded. "Indeed, because to the one who whispered it, it was not fiction, it was justice, or worse, justification." I sat. "You think the killer rehearsed it?" He lifted a brow. "I think the killer lived it." He took a long breath. "We are no longer deciphering motive, Mr. Goodwin. We are deciphering authorship. And in Wolfe's universe, authorship always leads to accountability." Wolfe summoned Cynthia Vance the next morning. She arrived sharply dressed and sharper spoken, but there was a tightness around the eyes that said her makeup was doing overtime. She sat across from Wolfe, composed but brittle. "You have," he said, "an admirable restraint, but I wonder how long you intend to keep it." She met his gaze. "If you're expecting me to cry, Mr. Wolfe, I'll have to disappoint you." "I expect nothing," he said, "but I observe everything. You were present during rehearsal the night before Dawn's death. Why?" "I came to pick up my mother's scarf." He tilted his head, and remained for 37 minutes. She exhaled. He asked me to stay. "Maxime?" "Yes." "Why?" She hesitated. Then, "He said he wanted to rewrite the ending." Wolfe folded his hands. "Did he?" Her silence stretched long enough to crack. "No," she whispered. "He wanted to break it." Wolfe's voice dropped. "What did he threaten to reveal?" She looked down. "He made all of us puppets." The words were soft, but they landed like bricks. And Wolfe, for once, said nothing at all. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, the silence thickening like cream in the air. I waited, pencil hovering above the notepad, but he wasn't speaking for my benefit. Finally, he said, almost to himself, "They thought they were staging tragedy." He closed his eyes. "But it's a farce." I frowned. "Farce with a body count. That makes it no less absurd. Only more dangerous." He opened his eyes again. Calm now, not weary, but resolved. "Prepare the drawing room," he said. "We've had our acts, now we require an audience." I nodded and stood. There was something about the way he said it, not with satisfaction, but with sorrow, as if he'd solved it not by hunting the killer, but by understanding the play. Wolfe doesn't summon, he commands. There's no ceremony to it, just a series of calls placed by me, each loaded with the kind of tone that implies disobedience will result in either exposure or expulsion. Most people arrive to the brownstone reluctantly. This time they came the way actors arrive at final rehearsal, uncertain, eager, and doomed to repeat their lines one too many times. Delia came in furs, of course, Judith pale and blinking, Cynthia with her back held straight enough to suggest steel. Theo arrived last, still smelling of backstage dust. Wolfe remained in the dining room until they were seated in the office. 6 chairs arranged semicircular, like jurors in a play they hadn't realized they were cast in. Wolfe finally entered, slow, deliberate, radiating the kind of presence that filled the room without lifting a single voice. He seated himself, adjusted his cuffs and looked at them not as people, but as patterns. "We have heard the lines," he said quietly. "Now let us examine the staging." I stood behind him, not speaking. The room held its breath. And Wolfe, as always, began not with accusation, but with order. We had barely made it through Wolfe's first sentence when the front door gave its signature grunt and Inspector Kramer arrived in the vestibule with the grace of a dropped sandbag. I met him at the hall with a smile I didn't mean. "I wasn't invited," he barked. "No," I said, "but you were expected." Like a second bell. He brushed past me. When he entered the office and saw Wolfe seated at the center of his own impromptu tribunal, he let out something halfway between a laugh and a warning growl. "This isn't a courtroom, Wolfe." "Correct," Wolfe said. "It is a room in which the truth may be heard without interruption. Sit or don't." Kramer didn't sit, but he didn't leave either. He leaned against the bookshelves like a disapproving father at a school play. I knew the routine. He'd listen, he'd fume, and then, when Wolfe had done the work, he'd collect the pieces. Wolfe turned back to the others. "Now then, let us begin with what was never meant to be found." Wolfe reached for the envelope I'd placed on the desk earlier that morning and removed one by one the artifacts. He held them not as evidence, but as instruments in a symphony no one else had bothered to rehearse. "The stage manager's torn page," he said, displaying it for the room. "Found conveniently in Miss Kessler's purse, with her name beside the cue pulley, a neat little tableau of guilt." Judith shrank visibly. "This cue sheet," Wolfe continued, holding up Theo's document, "does not match the logbook in timing. One is a forgery, the other a footprint." Theo shifted in his chair. "And this," Wolfe said, lifting a page from the full script, "is the line whispered moments before the fatal drop. A line never delivered on stage, never assigned to Judith, and excised during the second week of rehearsal." He laid it flat on the desk. Yet someone remembered it. Not as fiction, but as motive. Kramer leaned forward. Wolfe's voice did not rise, but sharpened. "A false confession, a missing cue, and a stolen line. These are not coincidences, they are staging marks." He paused. "Now let us look at the performance that was not meant to be applauded." "Miss Kessler," Wolfe said without looking at her, "you were not the killer's accomplice. You were their diversion." Judith's lips parted, but no words came. "You were chosen," Wolfe went on, "not for guilt, but for usefulness. You were frightened, obedient, and visible at the right moment, the perfect silhouette behind the curtain." She shook her head weakly. I wasn't. No, Wolfe agreed. You weren't. That was precisely the point. He gestured toward the paper trail once again. A planted cue sheet, a timed appearance, and a string of panicked behaviors that required no acting. You were cast in a role that required nothing but sincerity. Judith's eyes filled. Then why frame me? Wolfe blinked slowly. Because an audience, when offered a convenient villain, rarely looks for a playwright. Kramer made a sound that could have passed for reluctant interest. I said, so if she was the red herring... Wolfe interrupted, then we must now seek the hand that baited the hook. His gaze moved to the left, to where Delia Vance sat, silent, statuesque, waiting for her cue. Wolfe allowed the silence to stretch until it had weight. Miss Vance, he said, you insisted that the bells were omens, that they warned of something inevitable. She met his gaze, cool, unreadable. I believed they did. No, Wolfe replied. You choreographed them. She exhaled, a hint of laughter beneath it. That's absurd. Is it? Wolfe leaned forward. In theatre, the bell is a cue, a transition, a summoning. You knew precisely when they would ring. You used them, not as prophecy, but as punctuation. She said nothing. You needed a frame. You had motive, humiliation, betrayal, and irrelevance. Maxim reduced you, Harold embezzled you, and Judith replaced you. Delia looked away. You used the stage not as refuge, but as weapon. The deaths occurred not randomly, Tia, but in rhythm. Curtain times. Act changes. The second bell was not a signal of fate. It was the point at which the scene began. I watched her fingers curl against the armrest. Wolfe continued, almost softly now. You did not warn us. You directed us. He sat back. And you timed it all. Beautifully. Delia's eyes glistened. Not with guilt, but with something worse. Pride. Wolfe's tone had cooled, not gentled. Wolfe didn't do gentle, but settled into the stillness of a knife that had already cut. You orchestrated the first death, he said, to mask the second. A man as visible as Maxim Dawn draws the eye, draws the blame. But Harold Phipps, quiet, necessary, disposable. Delia didn't speak. You had the motive. Harold had defrauded your final production. He gave Maxim the leverage to humiliate you, publicly, privately, repeatedly. And you knew Judith would never be questioned so long as she panicked on cue. Still no reply. You rehearsed this, Miss Vance. Every beat, every echo, the whisper behind the curtain, the placement of the cue sheet, the whisper of a line never spoken, all of it written by you, performed by others. She finally met his gaze. Do you have proof? No, Wolfe said. I have architecture. Kramer grunted. That's not enough. Not for a jury, Wolfe agreed, but for truth. It suffices. Delia's lips curled. Then you'll forgive me if I remain unconvinced. She stood slowly, and then, just as Wolfe prepared to reply, Cynthia, pale and shaking, rose too. She turned to her mother. You told me it was justice, Mother. You made me believe it was art. The room stopped breathing. Delia didn't flinch. Her expression didn't collapse into guilt or fury. Instead, she tilted her head slightly toward her daughter, the way a director regards a new actress stumbling over the last line of a scene. Cynthia, she said, you shouldn't have come. I believed you, Cynthia replied. You said it would be poetic, that they deserved it. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. So the confession was rehearsed. No, Cynthia said quietly. It was directed. Delia turned to him, and for the first time, her voice cracked. They ruined everything I built. Every role, every word. I gave them years. They gave me replacement. Kramer stepped forward. Wolfe didn't move. There are no understudies in murder, he said. Only principals. Delia lowered her gaze. She didn't deny it, not with words, and that in our trade is the closing argument. Delia Vance sat still, her poise unbroken, even as the words her daughter had hurled lay thick in the air. No one moved, least of all Wolfe. Then, keen without drama or apology, she spoke. "Yes," she said. "I did it." The room exhaled. "But not as you imagine," she went on, "not in rage, not even revenge. I did it with intention, with rhythm, with elegance, because murder, gentlemen, is rarely beautiful. But this one was close." Wolfe made a sound that might have passed for agreement in another universe. "You crafted tragedy from contempt, you composed violence as critique, but it was not theatre, madam, it was blood." Delia gave a slight smile. "I disagree." She turned her gaze to Cynthia, not soft, not regretful, but direct. "They took everything from me, voice, role, relevance. I created one last stage, and in it I was not forgotten." "You killed 2 men, Kramer said, voice tight. Delia turned to him. "I directed an ending." I looked at Wolfe. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't even satisfied. He looked tired, not in body, but in patience. Delia had confessed, but not in guilt, in authorship, and that made it worse. Kramer stepped forward, slow but sure, the way a man does when he knows the spotlight is his, even if he didn't want the role. He reached into his coat and pulled out the cuffs with the kind of resignation usually reserved for undertakers and bartenders past midnight. "Delia Vance," he said, "you are under arrest for the murder of Maxim Dawn and Harold Phipps. If you believe this was art, I suggest you prepare your closing monologue." She rose without protest. "Do be careful with the wrists, Inspector. These gloves are Italian." I admit I admired her nerve. Wolfe didn't. Kramer turned to him, cuffs in hand, jaw clenched. "Satisfied?" Wolfe merely lifted a brow. "I am, as always, unimpressed." That earned a growl. "You could have told me." "You wouldn't have believed it," Wolfe replied. "And you'd have arrested the wrong one." Kramer muttered something unprintable, snapped the cuffs around Delia's wrists, and led her out of the room with the delicacy of a bulldozer chauffeuring a soprano. Wolfe didn't watch her leave. He stared at the empty chair she'd vacated, as though the real thing had never occupied it. I didn't blame him. Some exits leave silence behind. After they were gone, no one moved for a long time. It wasn't awkward silence, it was aftermath. The kind that arrives when the performance ends, the stagehands vanish, and someone remembers the lights need turning off. Judith sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes down, breathing like she'd just learned how. Cynthia stood by the window, staring out as if the city had something to offer she hadn't already lost. I felt the impulse to say something. I didn't. For once, silence felt like the only honest language in the room. Wolfe spoke, finally. "Miss Kessler?" She looked up. "You are no longer in danger." Judith nodded once. It wasn't relief, it was release. Wolfe turned to Cynthia. "You may wish to speak to someone." She didn't answer, but she didn't argue. As they left, I felt something unexpected, something Wolfe would have called sentimental, and Fritz would have offered soup for. I felt shaken. Not because of the deaths or even the manipulation, but because somewhere in all that orchestration, a daughter had believed her mother's curtain speech, and that belief had almost killed her. Wolfe remained seated, but I could tell something had shifted. Not fatigue, and that never came easily to him, but the weight of comprehension and the burden that came with it. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "the difficulty with deception is not that it is false, but that it mimics sincerity so precisely that the observer forgets to doubt it." "Sure," I said, "but you always doubt it." He nodded, solemn. "Because I must, not because I want to." I waited. He wasn't finished. Not nearly. "The theatre," he continued, "is not merely a refuge for liars. It is a laboratory of justification. The actor does not merely pretend, he persuades himself. He fuses role and identity until the illusion is no longer feigned. It is inhabited." He turned to me. "Miss Vance did not act madness. She became it, deliberately, skillfully, because it offered a rationale more palatable, than guilt. That's a trick, I said. No, Wolfe said. It is a tragedy. I stood there, watching the lines of his face settle back into their usual contours. Thought, annoyance, superiority. But beneath it, I sensed something rarer. A man who had glimpsed sincerity in artifice and found it unbearable. I took the long way home that night, not because of traffic, but because some stories don't sit easy, even in the back of your head. It's a funny thing, watching a woman orchestrate two deaths with timing cues and poetic logic, and still feel like you were part of her audience. Wolfe had dissected it, pinned it like a specimen, but I was the one who'd walked the stage, heard the whispers, watched the strings move before I knew who held them. And Cynthia, and the one person who hadn't pulled, manipulated or lied, had stood there like someone reading the wrong part in the right play. I'd seen grief before, but never rehearsed that well. It got me thinking, how much of morality gets rewritten when ego runs the typewriter? When revenge slips into costume and pretends to be something nobler? I'm no philosopher. I leave that to Wolfe, and he leaves the walking to me. But as I crossed 9th Avenue, I realized something. I wasn't angry at Delia. I was angry at how convincing she'd been. And that, as Wolfe would say, is what separates guilt from tragedy. Later that evening, after Fritz had gone to bed and the orchids were soaking in their humid dreams, Wolfe and I sat in the office. No conversation, just silence with the faintest curl of brandy. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You marked the bells, did you not?" I glanced at him. "Yeah." "Curtain, intermission, final cue." "First and second were tied to the acts. Why?" He turned his gaze toward the fireplace, though the flames had long since gone cold. "Two signals," he murmured. "But what if there's a third?" I didn't ask what he meant, not right away. Wolfe rarely phrased things carelessly, and he never asked questions he didn't already know the answer to. Instead, I leaned back and watched him. This man who refused to leave the house but could walk through a person's psychology like a lit hallway. He said nothing more, just sat there, staring into a darkness even the orchids couldn't name. The brownstone had a sound to it when things were done, not silence exactly, but a low hum of satisfaction, like a satisfied cat curling in a chair you had just vacated. After all the high notes and curtain drops, this was our encore. Wolfe in his chair, eyes half-lidded but vigilant, me in mine with a bottle of Rheingold sweating politely in my hand. There was no opera on the radio, no chewing of cigar ends, no muttering about Kramer's obstinacy or the ignobility of murder. Just stillness. Earned, not imposed. I stretched my legs and took a pull from the bottle. "You know," I said to the room, mostly out of habit. I half expected her to pull a final soliloquy from under her hat. Wolfe didn't move. "She had already delivered it," he said. "Through others." I nodded. It tracked. That kind of manipulation doesn't stop at the grave. It echoes in testimony, trembles in hesitation, and turns innocence into a stage cue. Fritz creaked through with a tray, then disappeared like a well-rehearsed extra. The storm was over. But in Wolfe's stillness, I recognized something familiar. He wasn't finished thinking. Which meant the play wasn't quite done. The envelope arrived without fanfare. No return address, no markings, but our own. Fritz handed it to me like it might sting. Wolfe, from his throne of mahogany and ego, merely gestured for it to be opened. Inside was a playbill, faded and brittle, the kind printed when typography still had backbone. At its center, a circle, deep, almost crude, drawn in red ink or something that wanted to be. Around the circle, a photo of a cast, decades old, faces young, eager, costumed in ambition. One of the faces was Delia's, another, I thought, might have been Harold Phipps, minus the cynicism. The rest were strangers to me. Wolfe said nothing, but the air in the room dropped by a few degrees. "No note," I offered. "No flourish, just the circle." "And the implication," Wolfe said. that we were not the final audience. I placed the envelope on his desk. He didn't touch it. Just looked at it the way a botanist eyes a familiar toxin, with recognition, distaste, and the faintest whisper of regret. The stage had gone dark, yes, but someone, it seemed, still had the script. Wolfe didn't ask me to research the date on the playbill, which is how I knew he already knew what it meant. But curiosity and I have been uneasy roommates too long to separate now, so I did a little digging. The production, A Winter's Folly, had opened in 1931. Closed after 8 performances and 1 fainting spell in the 3rd row. The Times had buried the review somewhere between stock prices and political affairs, but I found it. Ambitious, overwrought, and strangled by its own intentions. The scandal hadn't been public, but in theatre circles the whispers had teeth. A disappearance, a financial ruin, a playwright who vanished to Argentina with a soprano. I brought Wolfe the details. He didn't thank me. "The pattern persists," he murmured. "The past is not a memory, Mr. Goodwin. It is a rehearsal." "Who's doing the reviving?" I asked. He didn't answer, but he did glance at the fireplace, and that told me more than words. Some stories die, others wait patiently, powdered and painted for the right cue, and someone, anonymous, poetic and blood-red, had pulled the curtain back again. Wolfe didn't hesitate. He reached for the playbill, held it briefly as if weighing its memory, and then dropped it unceremoniously into the fire. It flared with a quiet whoosh, caught fast, and crumbled into soft-edged ash. The red circle was the last to go. "You don't want to know who sent it?" I asked, mostly for sport. "I know what they wanted," he said. "And I decline." That was Wolfe, in full bloom. The man who would dissect motive to the atom, but refused the dignity of a second act unless it suited him. "Some performances, Archie," he said, his voice almost too low for the air to catch, "are never meant to be revived." I let that sit. "Closure," I offered. "Concealment," he corrected. "Some truths are too elaborately staged to be undone. They depend not on what is revealed, but on what is permitted to remain concealed." I watched the last of the ash drift upward and felt the strange clarity of a man who'd seen enough to stop looking. It wasn't cowardice. It was something harder, choice. Not every echo deserves a stage, and some doors are better sealed with fire. I've sat through enough curtain calls to know when the applause is real and when it's just habit. The Vance case, if that's what we're calling it, didn't end with cheers, no ovation, just a collective exhale, like the audience had realized too late that they were part of the play. Wolfe, of course, had solved it, cleanly, logically, elegantly. But even he didn't look satisfied. And me? I was still wrestling with a question that hadn't made it into any of the formal testimony. Did we catch a murderer? Or an artist so lost in her own performance that the bodies were just necessary props? Judith would heal. Cynthia might. Kramer had his arrest. Wolfe had his truth. But I couldn't shake the sense that we'd all been cast in a show we didn't audition for. "Maybe justice was done," I said out loud, more to the ceiling than to Wolfe. "Maybe," I added, "it was just another show." Wolfe didn't respond. He rarely does when the final line isn't his, but this time I didn't need him to. I already knew the applause wouldn't come. The city kept moving as it always does, unbothered by solved crimes or unresolved emotions. The brownstone sank back into its routines, orchids, gastronomy, and silence weighted by thought. Wolfe resumed his reading schedule with the solemnity of a clergyman at a lost ritual. I resumed mine with a fresh notebook and the memory of a cast photo that had no business returning. There was no epilogue, no second act, just the echo of a daughter's tremor and a mother's justification dressed as theatre. In the end, it wasn't a question of right or wrong, not entirely. It was a question of belief in the roles we play, the illusions we choose, and the truths we bury behind velvet curtains. and as I locked the office for the night, I couldn't help thinking, not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes. The stage is dark now, the final lines spoken, the velvet curtains drawn over a tale stitched with jealousy, betrayal, and the ache of lost brilliance. Justice, if it came, wore a costume, tailored in sorrow, hemmed with pride. And somewhere between the bells and the silences, between illusion and confession, we glimpsed the frailty of human ambition dressed as art. But tell me this, when a crime is choreographed so carefully it resembles a performance, is the motive justice or vanity in disguise? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.